It's now time for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good afternoon, all. Al, there was an article in the New York Magazine last weekend that suggested that Biden was doing so much better in the polls at this point in the election than Clinton, Obama, or Kerry in the past. Given the shock of the Trump election 4 years ago, where most polls were dead wrong in predicting the winner, is it worth anyone's time these days to pay attention to these results?
Well, I always track polls as a hobby, and I love polls, but I know votes count. Polls don't really count. I don't really think the pattern in previous elections is going to impact this one very much. But there was something in that New York Magazine article that I thought was really fascinating, and it was Nate Silver's analysis of how much Biden would have to win the popular vote by to win the Electoral College. And essentially he said that he'd have a less than even chance of winning the Electoral College if he won by less than 3% in the popular vote. And since I think the race is going to tighten, I think it's important to take a look at that. So I did. I looked at in 2016, there were 16 states that had a margin of less than 10%. Hillary Clinton won 10 of them, and Trump won, or I'm sorry, Hillary Clinton won 7 of them, and Trump won 9 of them. Those are the 16 battleground states. Now, none of the 7 that Hillary won seem to be in contention if you look at the polling. In most of them, Biden's more than 10 points ahead, and the others, he's very substantially ahead outside the margin of error. But in the 9 states that Trump won, it's really interesting. In 3 of them, Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio, according to the Real Clear Politics average as of this afternoon, Biden has a small lead, but to be honest with you, I think they're dead heats and they could go either way. Those are 57 electoral votes. What Biden needs to do is turn 38 electoral votes in those states. But there are 4 others that include Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Arizona with 57 electoral votes as well. And Biden has a substantial lead in the average polling in those states. And the numbers work out so that if he wins Pennsylvania and 2 of the 3 others, he wins the White House. So let's throw out all the national polls and you tell me what happens in those 4 states, and I'll tell you who the next president will be.
Right.
I also follow the polling, but I think it's important to note that what polls represent is not a prediction about what's going to happen, and Al suggested that. It really is a statement of what people are not just thinking at the moment. I think it shows what people are willing to tell the pollster. And I say that because I think some people may well decide not to tell the pollster what their intentions are come November. Whether they think that helps their candidate or not, I don't know, but I think polling is getting more difficult. That being said, I've also gone through some of these state-by-state polls, and what I look for is which direction are the numbers moving. And but from early August to mid-August to late August to early September, in many of these close states, Biden's the spread for the vote for Biden has been increasing. So if I'm working for a candidate and I see that occurring, I feel really good if I'm working for that candidate. I really worry about the candidate that's beginning to slip in the polls. And because it's President Trump that is slipping, it's small, the numbers are small, you then have to ask yourself, what's going to change the direction here? The economy is not going to get distinctly better in the next few weeks. The pandemic is not going to be cured and go away in the next few weeks, in spite of what the president might say. And those are the economy and the pandemic, the virus, I think are the two big defining issues in this election. And so I don't see how the president can improve his numbers with regard to how he's handling those issues. And I think that movement will continue to go to Biden. I actually, I think a Biden victory could be fairly significant. Typically, I would agree with Al, the election's tightened, but in this case, I just don't see what pulls people towards an incumbent president who's struggling on two of the major issues, the economy and this pandemic.
Craig, staying with you, and speaking of polls, it looks like all eyes again will be on Florida as the critical state that either Biden or Trump needs to win to actually be the president. What's your early assessment of the state of play there? And do you have recommendations of what each camp needs to do?
So yeah, 20+ million people. Florida is a nation state. It's the population is diverse, but not only precinct by precinct, literally zip code by zip code, people tend to vote in common patterns. You can have two zip code next to each other and distinctly different outcomes in those elections. So the analysis of Florida that segments the component parts of Florida, I think is very significant. I do think it's close. Again, I do think that this is going to be an election that turns more on the economy and the pandemic than anything else. For example, I don't think Cuba is that big a factor. Traditionally, there's been a lot of voters that are concerned about that, less so today. Florida is a state that thrives on tourism. If you can't bring people to large gatherings in Florida, you cannot have a successful economy. So there's a lot of things I think that turn in favor of Joe Biden. On the other hand, you have very conservative segments of the state that are absolutely locked in place for Donald Trump, and they'll vote to reelect him. I really think this is going to turn in this case. It'll be interesting to see what my friend Al says about this. I really think the key is the suburbs. If Biden can move more votes in his direction in the suburbs, he'll do far better in Florida than other Democrats have fared. If he can't, it's going to be very, very close, and probably one of these races where it's going to take a few days before we know the outcome.
Al, what's your assessment?
I don't think that Florida is quite as essential to Joe Biden as it is to President Trump. As I indicated on the previous question, there are paths to the White House that run for Biden that don't run through Florida. But Florida is important, and it's important for a couple of reasons. One is what Craig said: the issues are the virus and an elderly population, and the economy that is, the tourist economy is really in shambles. So those cut for Biden. But it's also important because Florida reports early, and particularly if there's a winner, a decisive winner in Florida, it will set the tone for the night. If Biden wins Florida, it's probably Katie bar the door for the president. And it will make it a lot harder for the president to dispute the outcome of the election. So for that reason, it's important. But, sitting in Annapolis, it's sort of hard to get a good idea of what's going on in a state as complex as Florida. So I called my good friend, the former mayor of Tampa, Bob Buckhorn, to sort of get and asked him if what I've been reading is right. And here's generally what he said. He said the Biden campaign, and this is not surprising, has had not a great presence in Florida, very little presence in Florida, not a lot going on the ground. As I said in my spy op-ed about a month ago, he didn't have a presence anywhere. And he won because of who he is. But most importantly on that ground, he hasn't probably paid a lot of attention to the Hispanic vote. But that is now starting to change, and they've put a team on the ground. And the Hispanic vote is very complicated. There's the Cuban Miami vote, which is always Republican, but the growing Hispanic vote is the Puerto Rican vote that's really in the outskirts of Orlando, heading across the state toward Tampa. And they may be one of the important keys to winning the state. And the most important factor for Biden could very well be the $100 million that Mike Bloomberg is putting in the state to try to get out that Hispanic vote. And particularly focused on that Puerto Rican vote. What Craig said is right. Another key constituency in Florida are the suburban voters, and particularly suburban women across that I-4 corridor in the middle of the state. But there's a third important constituency. It's a military constituency. And Biden was down in Florida earlier this week hammering at the Hispanic vote, but also hammering at what President Bush said about military being losers and suckers. That's what he has to do. So if he can get that Hispanic vote out, if he can do well as Bill Nelson has always done in those suburbs across the state, the middle of the state, I think he has a good chance. But Florida is always tight and confusing, but it will set the tone on election night.
I'd like to just make one quick point that in building on what Al said about voters in Florida voting early, actually people around the country are going to vote early when they vote by mail. And this notion that there might be a problem with the voting by mail is going to encourage more and more people to go out and vote. And that makes it difficult for the numbers to change. In other words, if something happens in the last 2 weeks of the election, I think we're going to see more people having voted already in this election than in past elections. And I actually think that may help Biden. So the threat that President Trump is suggesting that somehow the mail voting won't work is causing people to go to the polls sooner, and that actually might work to his disadvantage.
You know, that's a particularly important thing in Florida because Florida has a history of a lot of absentee ballots. I mean, I remember several elections where the Democrat won on election day and on the election day balloting, but those absentee ballots that are counted on election night in Florida came in and changed the outcome. So a delayed count is unlikely in Florida unless we have something like 2000 where it's, it's a dead heat.
Finally, Al, staying with you, there was some other news this week. The United States engineered an agreement to normalize relationships between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Even critics of President Trump, including Tom Friedman of the New York Times, were praising those agreements. Is this a big win for Donald Trump, and will it have impact on the Jewish vote in November?
Well, I think it's a big win, period. Mideast agreements are good. They're good for our country, and I think they're good for Israel as well. I don't really think it's going to have a big impact on the Jewish vote. A lot of reasons that Jews are concerned, or at least a lot of Jews are concerned about President Trump, and he has his supporters in the Jewish community, and that probably will reinforce. But I don't think this is going to have much impact on the election, and Craig knows about that because he ran a campaign with Ronald Reagan where Jimmy Carter made the major breakthrough in the Mideast, and look what good it did him. I've had some experience in Israeli politics. About 15 years ago, a group in the centrist party that Ariel Sharon and Shimon Peres formed, Kadima, called me and asked me to come over and meet with them and see if we could build a center in Israeli politics. Well, as you can tell, I was a complete failure in that effort. But I did learn some things, and that go to one of the points, the last point actually in Friedman's article to which you referred, and that was that the two-state solution with a bunch of Arab countries now forming agreements with Israel is probably a thing of the past. And, you know, Ariel Sharon, that will make a big difference, because Ariel Sharon had an epiphany in about 2001, which was that the demographics in Israel were such that if you don't have a Palestinian state, it's going to be hard to preserve a Jewish democracy. And the point Friedman made is that the Palestinians are now become more of an Israeli problem, which means Israel will be dealing with it, because all the Arab countries will have made agreements with Israel. And what that means is that at some point the Palestinians are going to demand vote and rights, and that could really change the character of a Jewish democratic state. While I think it is great for the world that the Arab nations and the Israelis get together, it may have some unintended consequences that will have a greater impact on the long term of politics in Israel and the United States than just in this election.
Craig, much impact?
Well, as a foreign policy development, it's a major and significant development. And all who were involved deserve to be applauded, not just people in this country, but in the other countries. And this is something that's eluded us for a long time, and it should be celebrated. As a political matter, it's a dud. And it's a dud not because it lacks significance in foreign policy. It's a dud because foreign policy doesn't really count that much. It's certainly foreign policy successes in a presidential election. The Pew research recently showed that the economy, the coronavirus, the Supreme Court nominations, the outbreak of violent crime, all outpace foreign policy. So it's very hard to capitalize on a foreign policy development. And by the time we get to late October, this will sadly, in some ways, have been forgotten. But it's for another reason, it's not going to be that significant, and that's because it landed right in the middle of the stories around Bob Woodward's book and what Trump has done with the coronavirus. And so the news media and those who pay attention to the news media are watching stories unfold on an issue they really care about. And this just, I mean, I watched the news, this just didn't get that much mention. Even a moment for television was kind of lost. So yeah, great accomplishment, but not something that's going to help a lot in the election as far as I can tell.
Thank you, folks. See you next week.